It is the Resistance Report for May 3rd, 2017. It struck me the other day that we haven't really celebrated the 100 days of resistance. We've talked about the accomplishments or lack of accomplishments of Donald Trump and the Trump administration, but this also marks, actually it's now more than 100 days of resistance. So congratulations to all of you who have been part of the resistance. Thank you for your dedication, commitment, and your activism. What have we accomplished? Well, basically what we have accomplished so far is preventing very bad things from happening. That is, for example, repeal of the Affordable Care Act. Or, for example, many of the authoritarian tendencies of Donald Trump in terms of the courts and sanctuary cities and you name it. He did not get anything he wanted in the temporary funding bill that ends in September. And at least the heat is still on the FBI and Congress to investigate relationships between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives. More on that in just 1 second, but I wanted to give you this bulletin, and it is a late news bulletin. Apparently, Republicans have scheduled a vote tomorrow on their bill to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. They think they have enough votes. That's why they have scheduled their vote. What you need to do right now is get on the phones. Wait maybe until the end of this resistance report. But please do get on the phones tonight and tomorrow. Register your view with your member of Congress. Particularly if your member of Congress is a Republican, make sure that those Republicans know that if they vote in favor of repealing the Affordable Care Act, they are toast next year in the midterms. Now, what they have come up with in an effort to get wavering Republicans to agree is $8 billion of subsidies for people with pre-existing conditions. That's chicken feed, folks. That is not going to deal with pre-existing conditions because, you see, what the Republican plan is all about is letting the states opt out of the entire Affordable Care Act. And if the states opt out of the Affordable Care Act, there is no pressure on insurers to make health care affordable for sick people, people with pre-existing conditions. And that $8 billion is not going to change it. They're creating a separate risk pool, a high-risk pool for people with pre-existing conditions. And a lot of Americans, a lot of voting Americans have pre-existing conditions. A lot of them are Republicans. So you can bet your bottom dollar that Republicans will suffer if they vote in favor of this tomorrow. And by the way, if they do vote in favor of it, it's going to strengthen Trump's hand a little bit with regard to tax cuts and other things he wants. But I can bet you, and I'll make a bet with anybody who wants to bet, that it is going to increase the chances that we flip the House in 2018, next year, if they indeed do go ahead and repeal Obamacare. What about the other item I mentioned with regard to the resistance and the success of the resistance over the last 100 days, and that is the FBI and pressure on Congress to continue to investigate? Well, that pressure continues, but we don't see much coming out of those investigations precisely for the reason I mentioned a moment ago, and that is Republicans are still in control. They're in control of the House and the Senate, and indirectly in control of all of those investigations, including the FBI investigation. FBI Director James Comey appeared today before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he said he was feeling mildly nauseous. Mildly nauseous. Now, why is he feeling mildly nauseous, James Comey? He was feeling mildly nauseous, he said, at the very thought that his decisions about a probe into Hillary Clinton might have affected the election outcome. Well, James Comey, you should be mildly nauseous. In fact, you ought to be sick, because obviously it did affect the election. He says he had no regrets for notifying Congress about new emails Remember those emails related to Hillary Clinton and that investigation? Less than 2 weeks before Election Day, he said that to do otherwise, other than notify Congress, he said, would have been an act of concealment on his part. Now that is pure and unadulterated rubbish. For at least 3 reasons. Number one, the FBI doesn't normally confirm ongoing investigations or any aspect of an ongoing investigation publicly. Number two, we know that a lot of high-ranking officials in the FBI under Comey told him not to do that, not to notify Congress that there was a new phase of the investigation with regard to the emails. And thirdly, and most obviously, Comey did not inform Congress that there was an investigation ongoing of the Trump campaign and its possible relationship with Russian operatives to swing the election in his favor. And the mere fact that Comey did not do that throws cold water on everything else that Comey is saying. He has every right to be nauseous, not just mildly nauseous. James Comey had a significant influence. And one reason we are now dealing with Trump, and one reason we are now having to have a resistance to begin with, is because of James Comey. And finally, with regard to the resistance, the 103 days of resistance so far, we have successfully, as I mentioned a moment ago, held back on Trump's authoritarian tendencies. Now, people say to me, what do you mean authoritarianism? Well, political scientists use this term to describe a way of governing that values order and control over personal freedom and seeks to concentrate power in the hands of a strong man. Does that ring any bells for you? Donald Trump is not really a Republican. He didn't even register as a Republican until 2012. He's certainly not a free market conservative because he wants to put up walls and he wants to block immigrants and he wants to block trade. And he's not a libertarian. I mean, he has no trouble at all coming up with bills and supporting bills that will stop abortions and stop gay marriage. He has said that to court the evangelicals. So what is he? He's an authoritarian. That is what this is all about, folks. It's authoritarianism. Just to pull the strands together for you, briefly, an authoritarian would not follow the normal process in a constitutional democracy for disputing a court decision that authoritarian did not like. The authoritarian would do exactly what Donald Trump has done, and that is to demean and denigrate the particular judge and to call for perhaps the entire removal of the Ninth Circuit or busting up the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where many of those decisions come from. The normal process in a constitutional democracy for dealing with a court decision you don't like, if you're president, is to appeal those district court decisions up to a court of appeals. Not Donald Trump. He wants to reduce public confidence. He wants to embarrass. He wants to intimidate. That's what an authoritarian does. And likewise, an authoritarian doesn't have any patience for normal legislative rules designed, as they are in a democracy, to facilitate and foster deliberation. No, an authoritarian would be impatient. An authoritarian would say, as Trump did to Mitch McConnell, go ahead, change the rules, get 51 votes if you can get them for my Supreme Court nominee. I don't care about what happens to this time-honored process called what we have had for years. What Donald Trump says is archaic, and that is the filibuster. Donald Trump says over and over again he is willing and eager to get rid of the filibuster. He doesn't like these archaic procedures. What is an authoritarian? Basically says anything that interferes in what he wants to do is archaic. Authoritarians through history have sought to intimidate the press. Trump calls it fake news. Last Saturday, that rally he had was all about attacking the press once again. On Sunday, his chief of staff, Reich, I couldn't pronounce that before he became chief of staff, Reich, said that the administration was seriously thinking about reopening libel laws and widening libel laws so that Trump could actually sue major media if he felt that they were wrong or incorrect. Both Trump and Reince Priebus and others of them are outraged that the media is not falling into line. An authoritarian would also hate it that other levels of government have their own powers and responsibilities. Donald Trump doesn't like federalism. That's the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which reserves powers not enumerated to the states. Donald Trump doesn't want the 10th Amendment. That's why he's trying to impose himself, his views on the states with regard to sanctuary cities and environmental rules and so forth. And finally, authoritarians promote other authoritarians around the world in an effort to normalize authoritarian rule. That's exactly what Donald Trump has been doing. Last Saturday, Trump invited President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines to visit the White House. Now, Duterte, you should know, is not only an authoritarian leader who has no respect for democracy, but he's also accused of ordering extrajudicial, that's a nice way of saying without any courts involved, killings of thousands of people suspected of using or selling narcotics, as well as many others who have had no involvement in any shady dealings at all, or even accused. He once referred to Barack Obama, President of the United States, as a son of a whore. Those are his words, Duterte's. He's declared open season on suspected terrorists, saying that if he were presented with a suspected terrorist, again, not somebody convicted, a suspected terrorist, he said, this is his words, quote, "Give me salt and vinegar and I'll eat his liver," unquote. This is a man invited to the White House by Donald Trump. 2 weeks ago, Trump phoned to congratulate President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey for his victory in a referendum that is highly suspect. Observers have said and have provided a lot of evidence that there was tampering with that. A referendum that expanded Erdogan's powers and has set Turkey on the path toward dictatorship. Trump calls to congratulate him. Trump praises President Xi Jinping of China, the most authoritarian leader China has had since Mao Zedong. Trump has also hosted at the White House Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who had not been granted a visit to the White House since seizing power in a military coup almost 4 years ago. And it goes on and on. Authoritarian leaders like other authoritarians. Donald Trump's authoritarianism is consistent. It is a coherent philosophy of governing. Don't tell me he has no coherent philosophy of governing. He does. It's not Republican, it's not Democratic, it's not liberal, it's not conservative, it is authoritarian, but it is not America. It is not an American view. In fact, the framers of the Constitution had one major goal in mind with regard to separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, the rules they put into place. You know what that was? That was to stop authoritarians like Donald Trump. Trump advisor Stephen Miller declared, quote, "The powers of the president to protect our country are very substantial and will not be questioned," unquote. Really? Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Hamilton, they would have been, frankly, appalled at that sentiment. Which is why the resistance is so important. Why you must keep fighting. Why we must keep fighting. All the way to the midterms, flipping the House, flipping the Senate, if possible, and also, if he lasts to 2020, making sure Donald Trump is a one-term president, the one authoritarian president we have. And now your questions. Amy Saxton Mason, how can the Democrats effectively lead the resistance from within established party politics? They or we really need to be able to find a credible way to do this. Well, Amy, you're exactly right to ask that question, and I'm frankly not sure, because so far the Democratic National Committee and Democratic leaders sound very much like they sounded before Trump. They're making the same sort of noises. They are not taking on big money. They are not talking about a single-payer healthcare system. They are not condemning corporate welfare. They are not advocating for those who are working people and the poor against the privileged and the powerful. In other words, they basically are doing exactly what they were doing before. And you know something? Unless they turn themselves and the party into a movement and embrace all of the grassroots groups, indivisibleguide.com and swingleft.org and sisterdistrict.com and runforsomething.net and all the other groups that are springing up at the grassroots, the Democratic Party is going to be increasingly irrelevant. Next question. Diane Aquino Medina, what is the point of the Constitution or constitutional laws if they can just be changed on a whim? The rules change to get the Supreme Court justice confirmed, for example. Well, Diane, Supreme Court confirmation rules, Senate rules about when 60 votes are necessary to overcome a filibuster or not, those Senate rules are up to the Senate. They can be changed. Mitch McConnell decided to change them. They can be changed with 51 votes. But the Constitution cannot be changed, and we have federal courts and appellate courts, and we have a Supreme Court. Let us hope, with Neil Gorsuch there, we have a Supreme Court and an entire federal court system that exists in part to make sure that those constitutional laws cannot be changed. Ken Johnson, suppose that the federal government got out of the business of legislating health care policy and left it to the states. What kind of policy do you think California would get? Couldn't we create a first-rate system without GOP politics? The red states could do whatever they want. Well, Ken, I think you're right. I think California, it's gigantic. It's the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. 1 out of 8 Americans lives in California. It is big enough to have its own healthcare system. California could even have a single-payer healthcare system. I think it should. But what about people living in small states? Or what about red states? If you are a poor person in a red state, what are you going to do? You are essentially shafted. And that is one of the biggest problems, because most of the poor in this country, proportionally speaking, live in red states. Many of the people who need that Medicaid expansion live in red states. If the Affordable Care Act is repealed, millions of people are going to lose their health insurance. Millions upon millions. Many of them in red states. Some of them who voted for Donald Trump. And we're going to have more people dying because they don't have health insurance. Can we just make this clear? This is not simply a matter of politics and numbers and Donald Trump showing his stuff and boasting. This is a matter of real people, real numbers, real deaths, because people do not have health insurance. Nancy McConnell, I'd like to know how we can motivate our media representatives to follow the examples of European reporters who ask tough questions of Trump and his entourage. American reporters seem to be coercing this administration or covering this administration as a reality show. Well, Nancy, it is true. I've noticed the same thing. European reporters are tougher. They were very tough on Ivanka Trump. I think one of the problems here is that all of the negative statements coming out by Trump against, for example, MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post may have had the effect that they were intended to have. That is, perhaps just slightly intimidating or slowing down or softening some of the questions. But I am with you. I think when you are in the White House, if you are a journalist and you ask a question and it's not answered, other journalists have an obligation to follow up with that same question, make sure it is answered. Ashley Thomas, when are progressives going to stop investing in establishment parties and start investing in alternative parties or vote based on the merits of the candidates rather than party lines? Ashley, there are more people who are independent, who are not registered as Democrats or Republicans, than there are either Democrats or Republicans. And the largest party in the country, if you can call it a party, is the party of non-voters, people who don't even bother to vote. So we could conceivably have a movement that resulted in either a new Democratic Party or even a third party. There is a big void right there. I would think that progressives would do better putting up progressive candidates in Democratic primaries that don't now have progressive candidates. Do exactly what the Tea Party did. Be not only a thorn in the side of the Democratic Party, but actually take over the Democratic Party. David DeWitt, how do we get Sessions out of the Department of Justice? He's a linchpin to all other federal efforts. He flat out lied in his confirmation hearing. He's clearly a dangerous man with no sense of civil liberty or civil responsibility, I might add. David, you're right. I think Jeff Sessions, of all of the cabinet appointments, I would say Jeff Sessions is the worst by far. And that's saying something with this cabinet. Now, how do we get him out? Well, there is such thing as impeachment of a cabinet officer. That is possible. The Constitution does provide for that. I hope you have your handy-dandy Constitution very, very close by at all times. But we need probably to have Democrats in control of the House in order to start that kind of impeachment proceeding. Next question. Two more questions. Alex Chakula. Professor Reich, I'm becoming more and more disillusioned with Congress's attention to their plutocratic masters rather than us. I know the midterms are a good place to start. However, what else can be done in the interim? Well, Alex, I want to just underscore what I mentioned a moment ago, and that is right now, you ought to be making sure that there is a candidate in the Democratic primary, and that Democratic primary is coming up sooner than you know it. In your district or in your state, if your Senate is going to be having an election in 2018, make sure that there is a candidate that reflects your views. And if there isn't a candidate that reflects your views, make sure there is. Make a ruckus. Organize, mobilize, work with your indivisibleguide.com group to make sure that inside the Democratic Party there is a real contest, that progressives have candidates. And I'm going to say something that is, and several of you, I've said this before, and some of you find this a little bit disturbing, but I'm going to say it again anyway, because it's the truth. If you are in a deep red district that has no hopes of electing a Democrat, absolutely none. I mean, there are no, basically, I want you to consider doing something that many of you may not want to do, but it's important to at least consider it. And that is registering as a Republican and getting behind a moderate Republican candidate to take on a vicious right-wing Republican incumbent. Did you hear me? Good. Last question. James Plunkett, are you going to run for the Senate in California? James, I wish you hadn't asked that question. I have no idea. Please, please, please run, Dr. Reich. I will work for your election as hard as I can. James, first of all, I'm too short. Secondly, I'm too old. Thirdly, I don't have any money to, you have to be, well, I don't think you have to be rich. Fourthly, Dianne Feinstein is there, and I think I'll end on that note. That is tonight's Resistance Report, and I will see you tomorrow.